Nuclear fusion offers the tantalising prospect of being a potentially limitless source of clean and self-sustaining energy. But, as the old joke goes, nuclear fusion is always 30 years away, and has been for decades. I'm starting to get the same feeling about the Lifelong Learning Entitlement, or LLE, which was first floated back in 2019 as a new way of funding further and higher education courses in England. But the LLE took years to develop, and it wasn't until 2022 that the Conservative government launched a consultation on how the LLE should operate, and even then its planned introduction was not until September 2025. In April this year, the LLE was delayed until January 2026, and now in the Labour government's budget on October the 30th, it was confirmed that the LLE's first funded courses won't start until January 2027 at the earliest. So what do we know about the LLE and what it is trying to achieve? Could it be a big deal for students, colleges and universities, or is it just likely to be a distraction? And is there a risk that the LLE goes down the same road as nuclear fusion by always being a few years away but never quite being made a reality? My guests are Dr. Kate Wicklow, Director of Policy and Strategy at Guild HE, a membership body in the higher education sector, and George Ryan, an Associate Director at the consultancy Public First. I'm Tom Richmond, and to learn more about the Lifelong Learning Entitlement, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
George, the springboard for the LLE was Dr. Philip Auger's review of post-18 education back in 2019. So for the benefit of our listeners who haven't followed the LLE's whole journey over the last 5 years, talk us through why the Auger review concluded that the LLE, or at least something like it, was actually needed. What problems were the Auger review trying to solve with this new proposal?
Yes, very happy to answer that, and thank you for having me as well on the podcast today. So feels like a very long time ago now, the Auger review, but one of the key things that the Auger review was trying to do was, what do we do with the 50% of people who don't go to university? The focus on higher education at the expense of other pathways like further education, technical education, apprenticeships was one of the key findings of the Auger review. There was also general concern about rising skills gaps across the economy, particularly the higher technical space. That's level 4 and 5 qualifications like HNDs, HNCs, so that's higher national diplomas, higher national certificates. There was also concern that there was a decrease in part-time and flexible learning. This is something that's gone on for numerous years, but particularly since tuition fees went up to £9,000 in 2012, there's been a big decline in the number of people studying at university part-time. And this was partly as well down to the financial barriers and the limitations of the student loan system. So all of this kind of culminated in the solution, which was the Lifelong Loan Entitlement, as it was called then. The thought was that if you had a more flexible funding system that perhaps allowed you to study individual modules that added up to a bigger qualification over time, and you could receive funding for them like you do for a 3-year undergraduate degree, then that would help to increase the number of people studying, particularly at level 4 and 5, but also studying throughout their lives. So maybe you would leave school or college at 18, do a couple of modules of a qualification, then go straight into work. In 5 years' time, you might go back to education and top up your modules and eventually stack into a bigger qualification. But the idea would be that you would have many more options to study throughout your life.
Okay, that's very helpful, George. Thank you. So there's a huge emphasis on looking at those students who don't go straight into higher education when they leave school or college. Maybe signs of trying to reinvigorate part-time learning, trying to make the system more flexible so that people can dip in and out through what was, I suppose, basically a single student loan system for further education and higher education, which includes modules and units of courses rather than just entire courses as we do now. Kate, here we are in 2024. As it stands, what is the Lifelong Learning Entitlement, the LLE in its current form? What are the main features that the previous government chose to include within its design? And is that vision that George set out still pretty much intact at this point?
Yeah, it very much still is intact. There hasn't been a major change to the theory and the concept of the LLE since the new government came into power. So as you said, it basically consolidates two different adult education funding models. So the Advanced Learner Loan System in further education and the tuition fee loan system in HE. And people will be entitled to up to 4 years worth of full-time tuition. So taking account of the recent increase in higher education fees, that now equates to about £38,140. And also you'll be able to draw it down until the age of 60. So it's only available to students living and studying in England at a provider who is registered with the Office for Students. There's an interesting complication with how people are going to be registered. Everyone will have some sort of eligibility. So if you've already done a 3-year undergraduate degree, you might still receive an additional entitlement. And that will be based on kind of how many years of study you've done in the past. That also includes if you've done Scottish awards and also some level 7 programs. Essentially, we are bundling courses up into 30 credit chunks, although you can also offer something slightly different, but the minimum is 30 credits. What we don't know yet is what the fee level will be per credit. So at the moment, we know the undergraduate tuition fee cap is £9,000 plus inflation. But what we don't know is what a 30 credit cap would be. So we're not actually 100% sure whether that would be the same or not. And what we have also found out is that there has been a slight delay. So we're now going to be running those courses on a modular basis from January 2027 rather than January 2026, which was the initial idea. And on the government website, they've very helpfully clarified what will be available in January 27. So that is modules that are related to higher technical qualifications. So they are currently courses that have been kite marked by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, and all qualifications currently funded by the Advanced Learner Loan. So other qualifications such as university degrees will come slightly later. They haven't necessarily talked about what that might look like yet, but that will definitely happen slightly further down the line. So they're very much focusing in January 27 on higher technical qualifications and also FE courses that draw down an advanced learner loan. So as I say, nothing apart from the timescale is materially different. Actually, this government was very supportive of the LLE during its full kind of conception. What they did want to do, I think, is just make sure that what the policy was going to achieve aligned with their wider goals. So they've spoken a lot about the Growth and Skills Levy, which is a new flex on the apprenticeship levy. And they've also got a new organisation called Skills England, which takes over responsibilities for the Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education. So the pause is really about kind of working through what all of those things mean and kind of create a coherent policy going forward.
Okay, super. Thank you for all that detail. It's very helpful. Just to clarify for our listeners, you mentioned 30 credits. Am I correct in thinking that's equivalent to 1/4 of one academic year's worth of study?
Yes. When I think about my maths, yes, most undergraduate degrees run at 120 credits per year. So yeah, it's a percentage of that.
Okay, so they're very much looking, at least in this initial phase, of genuinely trying to fund bits of qualifications and modules and units, as they're sometimes called, through this LLE, and then we'll see the full undergraduate degree system coming online a little bit later on. It sounds to me as though the LLE has got several features that would potentially represent quite a departure from the current system of funding HE and FE through separate channels. So let's look at whether the LLE is likely to have an impact on learners and institutions. I think one of the clearest signals from the 2019 Augur Review was that it wanted to end the dominance of 3-year full-time undergraduate degrees, because the review felt, as George was saying, that there should be a greater emphasis perhaps on sub-degree level qualifications, so levels 4 and 5, which are equivalent to the first and second year of a degree course. And one of the hopes that I've seen often attached to the LLE is that it will promote exactly this shift towards sub-degree level qualifications, including this option of studying modules rather than entire courses and qualifications in one go. Kate, as someone who works in the HE sector, I'm curious as to whether universities and other HE institutions think this shift from 3-year degrees to shorter and perhaps lower level courses is seen as an opportunity or a threat to those institutions. The full-time 3-year degree model is presumably far more lucrative for a big institution, particularly, and even institutions at smaller levels too. So isn't it better for institutions to stick with the status quo despite what the LLE might be trying to achieve?
I think that that's a slightly different question than I think what the LLE is trying to achieve, because the whole concept of the LLE is to enable flexibility in the system. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all students are going to choose to do that flexibility. And I think we're not very clear what the market dynamic is at the moment and how much people want to study at a much slower pace than part-time. So we've seen a massive decline in the number of part-time students in the system after the 2012 tuition fee increase. Now, this might provide opportunities to bring some of those back into the fold and develop their confidence, enable them to try out before they commit to doing a full programme. But actually, we don't necessarily know what the offer is for people just taking a bit and then walking away and going back to work and then coming back and doing another bit. So the market dynamic is quite unclear, but it is a huge opportunity for higher education providers because we know that funding is a significant barrier. It also enables us to provide better collaborative opportunities with each other. So at the moment, we do an awful lot of franchise provision because the other organisation has facilities and resources that we can't mirror in university spaces. So we could definitely utilise the LLE to provide higher quality partnerships, both with FE colleges and with private institutions. But higher education providers can already deliver level 4 and 5. A lot of my institutions offer foundation degrees still because that's what their industry needs. But what I don't think the LLE is going to do is provide enough information, advice and guidance to the general public about what those sub-degree qualifications mean generally as a concept. And that's the thing that I worry about, is that we're kind of pinning a lot of hopes to the fact that this flexibility will encourage people to not do the full degree. But actually, the vast majority of young people understand what a degree is, as do their parents and their schools and their future employers. And they're less likely to understand what a level 4 and 5 qualification is if it's not already built into the industry in which they're going to go into. And also fundamentally, the biggest threat, I suppose, is that this is going to be far more expensive to deliver than having a cohort of people that we take through the journey. We're going to have less time to offer student support to those students. It will undoubtedly, if it takes off in this way, disrupt business planning and theoretical financial management for institutions. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about that market and what that means. And I think most of the institutions that I'm talking to at the moment are thinking about this as an added value rather than reforming what they already deliver. So there'll still be lots of 3-year undergraduate traditional degrees, but they're thinking through how they might market some of the modules that they currently offer to an external audience.
Yeah, very interesting seeing information as a barrier, even if the LLE actually gets off the ground. George, how do you see this dynamic of shifting from full degrees to sub-degree courses? Presumably the FE sector might be quite keen on this, even if some universities are still grappling with exactly how they approach it.
Yeah, this should be absolutely natural territory for further education colleges. And actually, they are already delivering a lot of level 4 and 5 qualifications, and a lot of the higher education offer in further education colleges is actually at this level 4 and 5. I actually think that this could be an opportunity for the HE sector. If you're encouraging groups of students who hadn't already gone to university or hadn't previously considered it because of constraints on time or worries about having to take on a very large student loan, if they could do a couple of modules, there's suddenly a whole new market of people that just wouldn't have considered university before. And I think as well that getting more adult learners in, especially in the reskilling space, we know that there's likely to be quite profound changes in the labour market, particularly around things like automation and artificial intelligence coming very quickly down the line. There's going to need to be a lot of reskilling. And actually, is there enough capacity in further education colleges alone to handle that amount of reskilling? Actually, there'll be a big role for universities to play in this more flexible and modular landscape. I mean, of course, there is going to be a challenge of universities adapting from that model. It's very lucrative to have 3 years of almost guaranteed funding per student, whereas if you're dipping in and out, students will be a lot more mobile, a lot more flexible. They might do a module at a further education college, a module at a university, and maybe a module with an online provider. And if they can all stack up into a qualification over time, then students might not want to stay at one university for the whole time.
Well, this point around adults reskilling, I think, is particularly interesting because, George, I know you've looked into this issue in terms of your own research and found some quite mixed signals around which adults and at different phases in their lives might potentially be interested in the sort of opportunities that the LLE in theory should present. So what's your verdict on the likely appetite from future learners, particularly in that adult space, for the changes that the LLE could bring about?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we have done a lot of polling on this, and what we found is that people don't necessarily think that they will need to do retraining in their lives. I think there's a bit of a feeling that retraining is for other people and not for me. That said, I think that there is an appetite from people, particularly in precarious positions in the labour market, to explore what options are out there for retraining. And I think that this is going to be something that is only growing, particularly as the labour market tightens in the next year or so. I think that for the people who didn't go to university and for whom education was probably 20, 30 years ago for them, there's going to be a bit of a task to persuade them that retraining through the LLE is something that they want to do. But it's very interesting. We don't know how people will react when they see that they have this lifelong, it's effectively a lifelong learning account, isn't it? We imagine there will be a number on a screen that tells you how many pounds you have to spend on your training. And maybe when people see that they've got this money, it might open up a new world of possibilities for them in terms of what they actually think about doing with the rest of their careers.
Yes, indeed. I think we've seen some mock-ups online of what a potential screen of information might look like for the finances. But of course, until we see that in practice, I guess it's quite hard to say exactly what we're going to see. Having said that, we did get a little bit of information about some of the challenges that might be on the way back in 2021 when there was a government-funded trial, which was launched to test the demand for short courses and also to assess the impact of loan funding on people's participation. The goal of that trial was to have over 100 courses available to over 2,000 students in 2022-23. But in the end, only 17 courses were launched and only 125 students enrolled, just 41 of whom took out a new student loan to fund their course. Kate, what do you make of those figures? I've heard some people say, well, it was a small trial, the system's not ready for it yet, it'll be fine when we get there eventually. I've heard other people say, surely this means there really is quite a big question mark still about whether there is a demand from young people and adults for this sort of shorter and more modular learning. Where do you sit on that spectrum? Are you feeling positive about it or perhaps a little bit concerned?
I'm not feeling concerned because we know that qualifications take a long time to bed in. And with such a high financial stake in it, people really do want to make sure that this qualification is going to do something for them and that it is actually a qualification rather than just a standalone piece of learning. Because we can be really honest about this. They can get standalone pieces of learning from lots of different people. Businesses run them, global platforms like Coursera run free ones, private companies do their own for all the kind of different tech things that go on. So they're either free or much cheaper than the higher education offer. So we do need to be really clear what our value proposition is and what the added value is of them undertaking this course through formal organisations such as universities or FE colleges. So for me, the short course trial was frustrating because it was very much limited in the time frame in which institutions could take part in it. The scope was also very restrained. So I completely understand why lots of people on the course either dropped out or decided against it, because they just didn't know what they were getting themselves into. What we do know, though, is that when we talk to current students and graduates about the debt that they've got into from a traditional degree system, they're actually quite relaxed about it because they have that understanding of what that onward value looks like. So I think we do really have to think through that when we try and get people a bit more actively involved in it. The other thing that I think is quite useful is that for universities themselves, because they have their own degree awarding powers, they're able to develop and flex their provision slightly more easily than FE colleges can. So we will definitely be learning as we go. So we'll be developing courses that we know businesses have told us that they ask for, whether that's because we currently run an apprenticeship program with them, or they wanted to run an apprenticeship program, but it wasn't flexible enough. So we have lots of business intelligence around that. We also have lots of business intelligence around the research, development and innovation activity that we do for local businesses in our local regions. And we're very much focused on thinking through what the future workforce needs. So what we also need is for government to invest in allowing people to understand what this new funding policy will unlock for them, whether that's through direct marketing and communications about the programme like they did with the HTQ activity a couple of years ago, or whether it's through the Skills England activity where they are mapping what future skills needs are going to be. And so we can actually pin some of that value proposition onto real evidence. I think a combination of those things will encourage the market, but it really is still very unknown.
And just in terms of demand as well, Kate, I think that some of our polling has showed that 79% of people would be more inclined to take a course if it could be completed in stages, whilst 74% of people have said that they would take a course on if they could do it in less than 12 months. And we also found that 78% would participate in training if they had the flexibility to choose when and how to engage with it. So those are quite high numbers in terms of people who would be willing to do something on a more flexible basis. Perhaps it's a matter of rolling this out more extensively and across the country and giving people the options. They might actually then start to take on more modular provision in greater numbers than the trial did, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other core thing is that we need to make sure that both HE and FE providers provide really good information about the support that they're going to be offering, because it's incredibly challenging to study whilst working and running a household or having family commitments or other caring responsibilities. So we do really need to make sure that we offer a support package and the ability to access education in a really flexible way to encourage more people to engage with it.
Indeed. So on this question of flexibility, let's say for the sake of argument that we do have enough demand from learners coming through the system for this type of modular and shorter course and more flexible training. But both of you have already mentioned some of the potential challenges that the providers themselves might face, even if we get people coming forward saying, yes, I want it. What's going to happen on the supply side? We could have a situation where we've got more and more students finding more opportunities to engage than they had before, which I think most people would probably say is a good thing. But it strikes me as really quite tricky for an institution to either break up existing courses into smaller units and modules so that people can choose them bit by bit, but also potentially, even if they were designing something from scratch, how are they going to do it in a way that means they can get the right staffing, they can get access to the right equipment, they can get access to the right support links with employers when, of course, employers are being pulled all over the place by various asks across government and I'm sure at a local level too. Kate, what's your perspective so far in terms of what you're seeing and hearing around how an institution is going to figure out whether or not it should engage with something like the LLE when it's already got a huge range of provision, both larger and smaller providers? It's already worked with large numbers of employers. It's already worked with large numbers of students. Is there a risk there's a bit of a cost to perhaps taking some of the focus off what they do and trying to push it into the LLE? What's your sense so far?
I don't think so. I think you're quite right to point out that there are lots of resource implications and we are going to have to deliver some stuff differently, possibly some more online content for a diverse range of providers, more evening classes, more weekend activity to ensure the greatest engagement by future learners. But Actually, I think the biggest challenge is that we can't just deliver standalone modules. It has to be part of a wider qualification. So there isn't quite as much flexibility as I think many higher education institutions would like, because many of them, including quite a few of my members, offer CPD activity already, which is little standalone units of study which they've negotiated with businesses or big industries that they can deliver because they're a specialist in that area. So you're right, we do have to think about, well, if you've got a full year of study, which bits would be helpful to run as a standalone qualification? Because not all of it necessarily would be. But we do also need to think through whether what we're offering enables people to study at a slightly slower pace than part-time. So the vast majority of our courses, you would be able to study them part-time. So this is a slightly slower turtle pace version of doing it part-time. So instead of taking over 6 years, you might want to take it over 7 or 8. But then, of course, that leads us into some really interesting territory about whether the value of that learning holds over time. So something that you learned 8 years ago, is that still the industry norm now? So we do need to be quite aware of what happens when we enable students to learn over a much longer period of time. And actually, that's one of the fundamental things that I'm a bit worried about with the credit transfer programme as put as a kind of policy question, because I don't think it is going to be very easy for students to pick and choose things at different providers and then go to one institution at the end and say, can you now award me a degree? Because it's far more complicated than that. Last week, my CEO wrote an article in Wonk about our kind of initial thoughts about this. We're working with the Universities UK and the Quality Assurance Agency in higher education to think through what an adapted credit framework might look like to enable some of these things to happen. But actually, the most interesting part, because we already offer recognition of prior learning and qualifications at the moment in higher education, but that's a very manual process. But what we don't necessarily do is carry credit from the further education qualification framework into the higher education qualification framework, which is two slightly different things. I think there's definitely more that we can do to create synergy between those two different qualification structures to enable students to move around a bit easier. But fundamentally, we need to kind of work through why students would want to do that and provide them with enough information, advice and guidance for them to make a genuine choice about whether that is the right thing for them or not. So again, it sort of comes back to a communication issue. In higher education, if we can see that there's a market need and we can, through some of the business activity that we're doing, then we will of course offer it. But we need to make sure that all of these things are genuinely in the interest of the student, which ultimately is going to be taking on the debt.
Yes, I think this issue of mobility and credit transfer, George, I know you picked up on it earlier as well. I mean, we've been talking for years, as long as I can remember, about this idea of you can take credits or units or modules from one institution and take them to another institution and then continue your learning in a beautiful and seamless way. We haven't got there after many attempts and many people wanting it to happen. I think I'm correct in saying that the Augur Review also wanted to happen, but we still haven't quite got it there. So, George, you've obviously been doing lots of polling in this space. You've been trying to gauge where adults are and what their appetite might be and what their motivations might be. Do you think we need to make some kind of progress on this credit transfer issue so that people can move between institutions? Or do you think adults that you've been speaking to are actually broadly happy with picking their local university and their local college, and they'll be quite happy to progress in that way?
I think different people will want to go through the system in different ways. And I think ultimately the success of LLE will hinge on getting credit transfer right. And it was probably going to involve the government having to step in and have some kind of way of standardizing what 30 credits looks like over time and what institutions can do to stack them into a larger qualification over time as well. And I think that will feel quite uncomfortable for many institutions who normally have a lot of autonomy about what the value of their courses are. But if we are going to move towards a more tertiary system, which we have a post-16 strategy launching sometime in the new year from the Department for Education, we suspect that there could be a move towards a more joined up system between FE and HE. I think these are the types of conversations that policymakers in sanctuary buildings will be having to have if they want the lifelong learning entitlement to be a success. But I think it's going to require a lot of compromises and a lot of discussion between universities themselves, but also universities and colleges.
It's interesting you say that, because I think it depends on what we mean by having synergy across the sector, because I'm very well aware that in higher education there are over 150 awarding bodies, essentially universities that have their own degree awarding powers, that have legal autonomy over academic standards. But what we do have is a sector agreed standard on what that is. So we've all clubbed together and created the framework for higher education qualifications. We've got a credit transfer framework. We've got subject benchmark statements which outline broadly what students should be studying if they're studying certain courses. But what we haven't done is had that conversation about how it aligns to what happens in the Ofqual regulated space. And I think there's definitely a role for Skills England to work both with us and Ofqual to create more synergy between them without necessarily compromising on our own ability to deliver the types of qualifications that we're used to.
Yes, it's certainly going to need a lot of coordination if we are going to go down that route. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. And like George says, if there's enough people motivated to make it happen, maybe we can get to credit transfer working really well in the not too distant future. Okay, we are reaching the end of this episode, so it's time for my final question for you both. I think there is a compelling policy case for introducing the LLE, but as we've discussed today, there are a lot of practical barriers that may stand in the way of getting there in terms of delivering this policy. We had a 3-year time horizon when the LLE was first outlined in 2022. We've now had 2 further delays that will mean the students using the LLE won't be starting their courses until at least 2027. So my question is, given all this complexity around design and implementation, and given all the other pressures facing students and institutions at the moment, is there a risk that the LLE will just prove too much of a distraction and end up being cancelled altogether? George, if I could come to you first, are you concerned that the LLE may never see the light of day?
I think if somebody in government really wants this to happen, if it's gripped well, then it could happen. But I think there's a real risk that it just slips and it gets cancelled in a couple of years' time. If it doesn't happen in January 2027, then I don't think it ever will, frankly. I think that there's a real risk around losing stakeholder engagement and policy fatigue over something that's been spoken about now for, by the time it's actually launched, we'll be getting on for a decade of talking about LLE without any action to implement it. I think that it's going to require a real exercise in getting the right people to think about what this will look like. I think the government's priority at the moment is getting the growth and skills levy right, setting up Skills England. And then once they've done that, I imagine that a lot of attention will focus on the higher education sector more generally. But I think that the LLE will be a part of that. I think we're expecting a higher education green or white paper in the early part of next year. And I suspect that there would be more detail about what the lifelong learning entitlement would look like within that. But I think that, we're looking at this in a wider context of higher education really struggling financially. We're also at a period of time where there's a real need for the workforce to have the right skills in order to compete globally. So actually, everything that the Auger Review set out the lifelong loan entitlement as it was then to do is still very relevant, if not more relevant now. So if somebody in government takes this forward, really grips it, gets the people around the table that need to be around the table, then I think there is a chance that January 2027, we see people logging on to their lifelong learning entitlement accounts and signing up to courses.
Thank you, George. Kate, do you think there is a risk that we may never see the LLE being delivered?
Well, it sort of depends on what we mean by it. So what I think is quite interesting is both the previous government and this new administration have both tried to do the hard things first. So the back end function of the student loans company is being developed and changed so that from 2025, those in the higher education system will be reported on by institutions to the student loans company on a modular basis. So the IT infrastructure will be in place. Then there's also the issue of bringing the FE funding and finance system into the HE student loan book approach. And that's the first thing they're going to tackle. So I think if we were in a position where they were saying, well, actually, only universities can do this in 2027, and we'll work out the logistics of onboarding new providers onto the Office for Students Register and what's going to happen with the FE funding. We'll leave that. I think that probably would be kicked into the long grass. But because they've invested in trying to fix that very early on, there's absolutely no reason why from 2027 or to 2029, we won't be able to offer some sort of flexible modular study. And there will be no structural reasons why that isn't possible. I also think it's really important to outline that this new government has really channeled the kind of communication that all higher study post 16 is important. It supports equality of opportunity. It improves living standards. It will drive sustained economic growth. So at the very least, we will continue to have policies, possibly in the white paper, as George was outlining, that will encourage more and more people to take on further study as adults, whether that's retraining or upskilling, because this government particularly values the importance of the knowledge economy and human capital development. So I've got no misgivings about it happening, but some of these things just might take a lot longer to bed in, like the market ideology and people understanding what they can do with their money when.
Thank you, Kate. Absolutely fascinating suggestions. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Kate and George for sharing their perspectives on the lifelong learning entitlement today. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.